The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as 200 pre-med students shuffled into their seats, each one carrying the weight of dreams that had taken years to build. Among them sat Maya Chen, her notebook already open, pen poised, dark eyes focused on the podium where her future would either flourish or crumble. She had no way of knowing that in exactly 47 minutes, those dreams would be shattered by 3 words that would echo in her mind for months to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maya had earned her place in this prestigious medical program through years of relentless dedication. While her classmates at Berkeley had spent weekends at parties, she had worked double shifts at her family's small grocery store in Oakland's Chinatown, saving every dollar for medical school applications. While others complained about organic chemistry, she had fallen in love with the elegant dance of molecules, the way carbon chains twisted and folded like origami made of atoms. The daughter of immigrants who had arrived with nothing but hope and calloused hands, Maya understood that excellence wasn't optional, it was survival. Her parents had sacrificed everything so she could sit in this lecture hall at Stanford University's School of Medicine, surrounded by students whose families had produced doctors for generations. She belonged here not because of legacy or connections, but because she had outworked, outthought, and outperformed thousands of other applicants. Her undergraduate record was flawless. 4 years of straight A's in the most challenging pre-medical curriculum Berkeley offered. MCAT scores in the 99th percentile. Research publications that had impressed even skeptical admissions committees. Volunteer hours at free clinics where she had learned that medicine wasn't just about science. It was about seeing dignity in suffering and hope in healing. But none of that mattered to Dr. Richard Whitmore as he strode into the lecture hall that crisp September morning. At 62, he commanded the advanced pathophysiology course with the iron fist of someone who believed that medical education was a privilege to be earned through fear rather than inspiration. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his white coat pressed to military precision, and his pale blue eyes surveyed the assembled students like a general reviewing troops he already deemed inadequate. Maya had heard the whispers about Dr. Whitmore during orientation week. He was brilliant, certainly. His textbook on cardiovascular pathology was considered the gold standard in medical education. But brilliance, she would soon learn, didn't necessarily translate to fairness. Some professors taught to elevate their students. Others taught to eliminate them. Dr. Whitmore belonged firmly to the latter category. The lecture began routinely enough. Whitmore launched into a complex discussion of autoimmune disorders. His voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in academic medicine, Maya took notes with the same meticulous attention to detail that had carried her through 4 years of undergraduate study. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't draw attention to herself, and certainly didn't expect to become the focus of what would happen next. 20 minutes into the lecture, Dr. Whitmore posed a question about the pathogenesis of systemic lupus erythematosus. The lecture hall fell silent. 200 students suddenly fascinated by their notebooks, hoping to avoid eye contact. Maya knew the answer. She had studied autoimmune disorders extensively during her research work, had even co-authored a paper on lupus biomarkers that had been published in the Journal of Clinical Immunology. But she hesitated. In her undergraduate classes, professors had welcomed participation, had encouraged students to engage with the material. Medical school, she was learning, operated by different rules. Students were expected to absorb information silently, to prove their worth through examinations rather than classroom discussion. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Dr. Whitmore's expression darkened as he scanned the rows of downcast eyes. Finally, his gaze settled on Maya, perhaps because she was one of the few students actually looking at him rather than hiding behind her textbook. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the silent amphitheater. "Since you appear to be paying attention, perhaps you can enlighten us about the molecular mechanisms underlying lupus nephritis." Maya felt every eye in the lecture hall turn toward her. Her heart rate quickened, but her voice remained steady as she began to answer. She explained the role of immune complex deposition, the activation of complement cascades, the inflammatory damage to glomerular structures. Her answer was comprehensive, accurate, and delivered with the confidence of someone who truly understood the material. But instead of acknowledgement or approval, Dr. Whitmore's face hardened into something approaching contempt. The lecture hall remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. Students could sense tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Textbook regurgitation, Dr. Whitmore said dismissively. Anyone can memorize facts, Miss Chen. Medicine requires analytical thinking, not rote learning. Maya felt her cheeks burn, but she maintained her composure. She had not simply regurgitated textbook material. Her answer had drawn from cutting-edge research, from papers published within the last year. But challenging a professor's assessment, she understood instinctively, would only make things worse. Dr. Whitmore wasn't finished. He moved closer to her row, his presence looming over the tiered seating. Tell me, Miss Chen, what makes you think you have what it takes to succeed in this program? The question hung in the air like a blade. Around Maya, students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that something beyond normal academic discourse was unfolding. This wasn't a teaching moment. It was something else entirely. Maya chose her words carefully. I believe my academic record and research experience demonstrate my commitment to medicine, sir. Dr. Whitmore's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. Academic record. Research experience. Do you know how many students sit in this hall with perfect grades? Do you know how many have published papers? His voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the amphitheater. What I don't see is the kind of intuitive understanding that separates real doctors from mere test-takers. The attack was subtle but unmistakable. Maya felt the words like physical blows, each one designed to undermine her confidence, to make her question her place in this room. Around her, classmates avoided eye contact, grateful that they weren't the target of Dr. Whitmore's scrutiny. Perhaps, Dr. Whitmore continued, his voice now carrying the weight of final judgment, you would be better suited to a career that values memorization over innovation. Pharmacy, perhaps, or medical technology. The implication was clear. Real medicine, the kind practiced by doctors, required something Maya apparently lacked. The message resonated with ugly stereotypes that Maya had encountered throughout her academic career, whispered assumptions about Asian students being good at memorization but lacking creativity or analytical thinking. But Dr. Whitmore wasn't done delivering his verdict. He returned to the podium, but his attention remained focused on Maya, like a spotlight she couldn't escape. You know, Miss Chen, I've been teaching medicine for 30 years. I can usually tell within the first few weeks which students have what it takes, and which ones are simply wasting everyone's time. The lecture hall was so quiet that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. 200 students held their breath, witnessing something that felt more like an execution than education. Dr. Whitmore's final words landed with devastating precision. You don't belong here. The phrase echoed through the amphitheater, through Maya's mind, through the careful construction of confidence she had built over years of academic achievement. 4 simple words that carried the weight of institutional authority, that seemed to erase everything she had accomplished, everything she had sacrificed to reach this moment. Maya sat frozen in her seat as Dr. Whitmore resumed his lecture as if nothing had happened. Around her, classmates stared at their notebooks, uncomfortable witnesses to what they had just observed. The remaining hour of class passed in a blur. Maya took notes mechanically, her hand moving across the page while her mind reeled from what had just occurred. When the lecture finally ended, students filed out in unusual silence. A few glanced at Maya with expressions ranging from sympathy to relief that they hadn't been targeted. Most simply hurried away, eager to distance themselves from the uncomfortable scene they had witnessed. Maya remained in her seat until the amphitheater was nearly empty. Her notebook lay open before her, filled with detailed notes that now seemed meaningless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She had prepared for medical school's academic challenges, had steeled herself for long hours and difficult material, but she hadn't prepared for this, for having her very presence questioned by someone who held power over her future. As she finally gathered her belongings, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the lecture hall's darkened windows. She saw a young woman who had worked harder than most of her peers, who had sacrificed more, who had earned her place through merit rather than privilege. But in Dr. Whitmore's classroom, none of that seemed to matter. The walk across campus to her small studio apartment felt longer than usual. Maya moved through crowds of students discussing their classes, complaining about professors, making plans for study groups. Their conversations seemed to come from another world, a world where belonging wasn't questioned, where competence was assumed rather than constantly proven. In her apartment, Maya sat at her desk, surrounded by medical textbooks and research papers. The same materials that had once filled her with excitement now seemed to mock her ambitions. Dr. Whitmore's words echoed in her mind. "You don't belong here." The phrase had been delivered with such certainty, such authority, that Maya found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her own capabilities. She picked up her phone to call her parents, then set it down again. How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell them that their daughter, the one they bragged about to neighbors, the one who represented all their hopes for a better life in America, had been told she didn't belong in the very place they had sacrificed everything to help her reach? Instead, Maya opened her pathophysiology textbook and began to read. If Dr. Whitmore believed she was nothing more than a memorization machine, then she would prove him wrong. If he thought she lacked analytical thinking, she would demonstrate otherwise. If he believed she didn't belong, she would earn her place through excellence so undeniable that even he would be forced to acknowledge it. But as Maya studied late into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey had just become infinitely more difficult. Dr. Whitmore hadn't simply questioned her knowledge. He had questioned her right to be there at all. And in the hierarchical world of medical education, where professors held enormous power over students' futures, such questions could become self-fulfilling prophecies. The next morning brought Maya's first real test of her resolve. As she entered the pathophysiology lecture hall, she felt every eye upon her. Word of the previous day's encounter had spread through the first-year class, with the speed that gossip always traveled in closed communities. Some students looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of uncomfortable distance that people maintain from those they perceive as marked for failure. Dr. Whitmore entered the classroom with his usual commanding presence, but Maya noticed that his gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer than necessary. It was a look that said their interaction was far from over, that yesterday's humiliation had been merely an opening salvo in what promised to be a much longer campaign. The lecture proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes. Dr. Whitmore discussed the pathophysiology of heart failure, with his characteristic blend of expertise and condescension. Maya took notes as carefully as ever, but she could feel tension building in the room. Students kept glancing between her and the professor, waiting for the next confrontation. It came sooner than expected. Dr. Whitmore paused mid-sentence while explaining the Frank-Starling mechanism and turned his attention to Maya. "Miss Chen, since you seem so confident in your understanding of cardiovascular physiology, perhaps you can explain why ACE inhibitors are contraindicated in patients with bilateral renal artery stenosis." The question was advanced, typically covered in clinical courses rather than basic pathophysiology. It was designed to trip her up, to expose gaps in her knowledge that would justify yesterday's harsh assessment. Maya recognized the trap, but she also recognized the opportunity. She had encountered this exact clinical scenario during her research work on renovascular hypertension. More importantly, she understood not just the factual answer but the underlying physiological principles that made ACE inhibitors dangerous in this specific context. ACE inhibitors block the conversion of angiotensin I to angiotensin II, Maya began, her voice steady despite the pressure she felt from 200 pairs of eyes. In patients with bilateral renal artery stenosis, the kidneys are already hypoperfused due to the stenotic lesions. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system becomes the primary mechanism maintaining glomerular filtration pressure through angiotensin II-mediated efferent arteriolar vasoconstriction. She paused, making sure her explanation was clear before continuing. When you block angiotensin II formation with an ACE inhibitor, you eliminate this compensatory mechanism. Glomerular filtration pressure drops precipitously, leading to acute kidney injury that can progress to complete renal failure. The lecture hall remained silent, but Maya could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Her answer wasn't just correct, it was comprehensive, demonstrating exactly the kind of analytical thinking Dr. Whitmore claimed she lacked. But instead of acknowledgement, Dr. Whitmore's expression hardened further. "And where did you learn that, Miss Chen? Which textbook chapter did you memorize?" The dismissal stung, but Maya had expected it. "I encountered this scenario during my undergraduate research on renovascular hypertension, sir. We had a case study involving a patient who developed acute renal failure after starting lisinopril for blood pressure control." Dr. Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Maya's answer revealed not just knowledge but practical experience. the kind of real-world application that couldn't be dismissed as mere memorization, but admitting that would require acknowledging that his assessment of her had been wrong, and Maya was beginning to understand that Dr. Whitmore was not the kind of man who admitted mistakes easily. "Research experience doesn't make up for fundamental gaps in understanding," he said finally. "Anyone can stumble across the right answer occasionally." The response was illogical and unfair, but Maya recognized that logic and fairness were not governing this interaction. Something else was at play, something that had nothing to do with her knowledge or capabilities, and everything to do with Dr. Whitmore's preconceptions about who belonged in his classroom. As the lecture continued, Maya noticed other students watching her with new interest. Her answer had been impressive, and several of her classmates seemed to be reassessing their initial impressions. But Maya also noticed something else. A few students whose expressions had hardened into something approaching resentment. These were students who had struggled with Dr. Whitmore's questions, who had been grateful to avoid his scrutiny. Maya's competent response highlighted their own limitations, and some seemed to blame her for raising the bar, rather than criticizing Dr. Whitmore for his unfair treatment. After class, Maya was approached by a small group of students. The leader was James Harrison, whose father and grandfather had both attended Stanford Medical School. James possessed the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to be anywhere. "That was impressive," James said, his tone carrying undertones Maya couldn't quite decipher. "Though you might want to be careful about showing up Whitmore too often. He doesn't like students who make him look bad." The warning was delivered as friendly advice, but Maya sensed something else beneath the surface. James and his friends weren't necessarily hostile, but they weren't entirely supportive either. They seemed to view her situation as entertainment, a drama that made their own medical school experience more interesting without directly affecting them. "I'm just trying to learn," Maya said simply. "Of course," James replied. "Just remember that there's a difference between learning and grandstanding. Whitmore's been here 30 years. He knows what he's talking about." The implication was clear. Any conflict between Maya and Dr. Whitmore was her fault for being too aggressive, too eager to prove herself. The responsibility for maintaining classroom harmony fell on her shoulders, not on the professor who had publicly humiliated her for no justifiable reason. As Maya walked away from the group, she realized that her challenges extended beyond Dr. Whitmore's classroom. The social dynamics of medical school were more complex than she had anticipated. Success required not just academic excellence, but careful navigation of relationships, hierarchies, and unspoken rules that governed who was allowed to excel and under what circumstances. That evening, Maya sat in the medical library surrounded by pathophysiology textbooks and journal articles. She had always found solace in study, in the clear logic of scientific principles and the satisfaction of understanding complex systems. But tonight, even her books couldn't provide escape from the growing realization that her medical school experience would be defined by more than academic challenges. She thought about her parents, who had worked 16-hour days to pay for her education. She thought about her younger brother, who looked up to her as proof that their family's sacrifices had meaning. She thought about the patients she hoped to serve, people who needed doctors who understood struggle and perseverance. Most of all, she thought about Dr. Whitmore's words. "You don't belong here." The phrase had been designed to break her spirit, to convince her that her presence in medical school was a mistake that would inevitably be corrected. But as Maya sat surrounded by medical knowledge she was determined to master, she made a different choice. She would prove that she belonged not through arguments or confrontations, but through excellence so undeniable that even her harshest critics would be forced to acknowledge it. If Dr. Whitmore wanted to test her knowledge, she would demonstrate mastery of every concept he taught. If he wanted to question her analytical thinking, she would provide insights that revealed the depth of her understanding. Maya Chen didn't belong in medical school because someone in authority decided she did. She belonged because she had earned her place through years of dedication, because she possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to become an excellent physician, and because patients deserved doctors who understood that healing required both scientific knowledge and human empathy. The battle lines had been drawn in Dr. Whitmore's classroom, but Maya was prepared for a war that would be fought with textbooks and examinations, with late nights and early mornings, with the kind of relentless preparation that had carried her from a small grocery store in Oakland to the hallowed halls of Stanford Medical School. She opened her pathophysiology textbook and began to read, determined to master every concept, understand every mechanism, and prepare for every question Dr. Whitmore might pose. If he believed she didn't belong, she would prove him wrong, one correct answer at a time. The first examination arrived 3 weeks later, carrying with it the weight of everything that had transpired in Dr. Whitmore's classroom. Maya had spent countless hours preparing, reviewing not just the assigned material, but delving deep into primary research papers, clinical case studies, and advanced texts that went far beyond the course requirements. As students filed into the examination room, Maya could feel the nervous energy that always preceded high-stakes testing. But this exam felt different. Word of her confrontations with Dr. Whitmore had spread throughout the first-year class, and many students were curious to see whether her classroom confidence would translate to examination performance. Dr. Whitmore proctored the exam personally, something he rarely did for routine testing. As he distributed the question papers, his gaze lingered on Maya with an expression that seemed to say he was looking forward to her inevitable failure. The exam, Maya realized, had been designed not just to test knowledge, but to prove a point about who truly belonged in advanced medical education. The questions were brutal. They went far beyond basic pathophysiology, requiring integration of concepts from multiple disciplines and application of principles to complex clinical scenarios. Many questions demanded the kind of analytical thinking Dr. Whitmore claimed Maya lacked, requiring students to synthesize information rather than simply recall facts. But as Maya read through the examination, she felt a surge of confidence. These were exactly the kinds of questions she had been preparing for, the complex scenarios that revealed true understanding rather than superficial memorization. Her months of intensive study, her research experience, and her natural analytical abilities had prepared her for this moment. She worked through the exam methodically, taking time to think through each question carefully before committing to her answers. Around her, she could hear other students struggling, the nervous sighs and frustrated pencil tapping that accompanied difficult examinations. But Maya felt calm, focused, drawing upon knowledge she had earned through dedication and discipline. The final question was particularly challenging, a complex case study involving a patient with multiple organ system failures. Students were asked to identify the underlying pathophysiology, explain the cascade of events leading to the patient's condition, and propose treatment strategies based on their understanding of disease mechanisms. Maya smiled as she read the question. It was similar to cases she had studied during her undergraduate research, patients whose complex presentations required exactly the kind of integrative thinking she had been developing for years. She wrote her answer carefully, drawing connections between seemingly disparate symptoms and explaining the underlying mechanisms with the precision of someone who truly understood the material. As she submitted her examination, Maya caught Dr. Whitmore's eye. His expression was unreadable, but she sensed anticipation. He was expecting her to fail, expecting this examination to prove that her classroom performances had been lucky guesses rather than demonstrations of genuine competence. The results were posted 1 week later. Maya stood before the bulletin board alongside dozens of other anxious students, scanning the list for her student identification number. When she found it, she had to read it twice to make sure she wasn't mistaken. Her score was 98%, the highest grade in the class. Around her, students reacted with a mixture of surprise, admiration, and, in some cases, resentment. Maya had not just passed Dr. Whitmore's examination, she had dominated it, demonstrating exactly the kind of analytical thinking and comprehensive understanding that he claimed she lacked. But Maya's satisfaction was tempered by the realization that one examination, no matter how impressive, would not end her challenges. Dr. Whitmore had invested too much credibility in his assessment of her capabilities to accept this result gracefully. If anything, her success would only intensify his determination to prove that she didn't belong in his classroom. She was right. The very next class, Dr. Whitmore announced a change in his examination format. "I've noticed that some students have been relying too heavily on memorization rather than developing genuine understanding," he said, his eyes finding Maya in the crowd. "Therefore, future examinations will place greater emphasis on spontaneous analysis and creative problem-solving." The message was clear. The rules were being changed specifically to disadvantage Maya's strengths. If rote memorization was her weakness, Dr. Whitmore would eliminate opportunities for students to succeed through preparation and hard work. If analytical thinking was supposedly her limitation, he would create examinations that supposedly required intuitive leaps rather than systematic reasoning. Maya understood that she was no longer just fighting for good grades. She was fighting for her right to succeed in medical school despite facing obstacles that her classmates didn't encounter. Dr. Whitmore had decided that her success threatened his authority, and he was prepared to use his power as an instructor to prove that his initial assessment had been correct. But Maya Chen had not come this far to be derailed by one professor's prejudice. She had overcome poverty, discrimination, and countless other obstacles to reach Stanford Medical School. She would overcome this challenge as well, armed with the same determination that had carried her from a small grocery store in Oakland to the top of her medical school class. The war for her future was just beginning, but Maya had already fired the first shot, and it had found its target with devastating accuracy. The second examination arrived with an ominous announcement. Dr. Whitmore had restructured the entire assessment format, claiming that medical education required more than academic performance. It demanded what he called clinical intuition and professional judgment. The new examination would be administered orally, with students required to respond to scenarios in real time without the benefit of written notes or extended preparation time. Maya recognized the trap immediately. Oral examinations were notoriously subjective, dependent on the examiner's interpretation of student responses rather than objective measures of knowledge. Dr. Whitmore would have complete control over both the questions and the evaluation of her answers, creating opportunities for bias that written examinations couldn't provide. As the examination date approached, Maya threw herself into preparation with even greater intensity. She studied not just the facts but the reasoning behind every concept, practicing her ability to articulate complex ideas clearly and concisely. She knew that Dr. Whitmore would scrutinize not just her knowledge but her delivery, looking for any hesitation or uncertainty that could be interpreted as incompetence. The oral examination was conducted in Dr. Whitmore's office, a space designed to intimidate. Medical textbooks lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Certificates and awards documented 3 decades of academic achievement, and a massive mahogany desk created a barrier between professor and student that emphasized the power differential inherent in the relationship. Maya entered the office precisely at her scheduled time, her posture erect and her expression calm, despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Dr. Whitmore gestured to a chair positioned directly across from his desk, placing her in a spotlight while he remained partially shadowed behind stacks of papers and books. The examination began with routine questions about cardiovascular pathophysiology, topics Maya had mastered through weeks of intensive study. She answered each question completely and accurately, providing the level of detail that demonstrated comprehensive understanding rather than superficial knowledge. But Dr. Whitmore's expression remained skeptical, as if he was waiting for her to reveal the limitations he was certain existed. As the examination progressed, the questions became increasingly complex and specialized. Dr. Whitmore asked about rare genetic disorders, obscure drug interactions, and clinical scenarios that would challenge even experienced physicians. Maya drew upon every resource at her disposal: her research experience, her extensive reading, and her ability to reason through unfamiliar problems using fundamental principles. When Dr. Whitmore asked about the pathophysiology of primary hyperaldosteronism, Maya not only explained the basic mechanisms but discussed recent research on aldosterone's role in cardiovascular remodeling, drawing connections to her undergraduate work on hypertensive kidney disease. When he questioned her about drug-induced lupus, she described not just the clinical presentation, but the molecular mechanisms underlying different drug sensitivities and the genetic factors that influenced individual risk. With each comprehensive answer, Maya could see Dr. Whitmore's frustration growing. He had designed this examination to expose her alleged limitations, but instead she was demonstrating mastery that exceeded his expectations. Her responses weren't just correct, they were sophisticated, revealing the kind of deep understanding that comes from genuine intellectual engagement with the material. But Dr. Whitmore wasn't prepared to concede defeat. As the examination stretched beyond its scheduled time, his questions became increasingly hostile and demanding. He interrupted her answers, challenged her interpretations, and demanded justifications for clinical reasoning that he wouldn't have questioned from other students. The turning point came when Dr. Whitmore presented a complex case study, involving a patient with multiple comorbidities and conflicting clinical findings. The scenario was deliberately ambiguous, designed to have multiple possible interpretations rather than a single correct answer. It was exactly the kind of question that revealed clinical judgment rather than factual knowledge. Maya listened carefully to the case presentation, taking mental notes of the key findings and their potential significance. When Dr. Whitmore finished, she asked several clarifying questions about the patient's history and laboratory results, questions that demonstrated her systematic approach to clinical problem-solving. Then she began her analysis. She outlined 3 possible diagnostic pathways, explaining the evidence that supported each hypothesis and the additional testing that would be needed to differentiate between them. She discussed the urgency of different interventions, the risks and benefits of various treatment approaches, and the factors that would influence clinical decision-making in real-world settings. Her response was masterful, demonstrating exactly the kind of analytical thinking and clinical reasoning that Dr. Whitmore claimed she lacked. But instead of acknowledging her competence, he attacked her methodology. "You're overthinking the problem, Miss Chen," he said dismissively. "Good clinicians develop intuitive sense for these cases. They don't need to construct elaborate analytical frameworks to reach obvious conclusions." The criticism was illogical and contradictory. Dr. Whitmore was simultaneously demanding analytical thinking and criticizing Maya for being too analytical. He wanted clinical intuition but dismissed the systematic reasoning that formed the foundation of sound clinical judgment. Maya realized that she was trapped in an impossible situation. No matter how well she performed, Dr. Whitmore would find reasons to criticize her approach. If she answered quickly, she was being superficial. If she answered thoroughly, she was overthinking. If she demonstrated knowledge, she was just memorizing. If she showed analytical skills, she was being too academic. The oral examination concluded with Dr. Whitmore's assessment, delivered in tones that suggested deep disappointment. "Miss Chen, while your factual knowledge is adequate, I remain concerned about your clinical reasoning abilities. Medicine requires intuitive understanding that can't be taught through textbooks or research papers." Maya left the examination knowing that her performance had been exceptional but that her grade would reflect drive, Whitmore's predetermined conclusions, rather than her actual competence. She had answered every question correctly, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex topics, and shown exactly the kind of clinical reasoning that distinguished excellent physicians from merely adequate ones. When the results were posted 3 days later, Maya wasn't surprised to see that she had received a B-, despite a performance that should have earned the highest marks. The grade was just high enough to avoid raising questions from other faculty members, but low enough to damage her class ranking and potentially affect her future opportunities. More troubling than the grade itself was the written evaluation that accompanied it. Dr. Whitmore had documented concerns about Maya's rigid thinking patterns and, quote, over-reliance on academic frameworks rather than clinical intuition. The evaluation would become part of her permanent academic record, potentially influencing future professors and residency directors who might never have the opportunity to assess her competence directly. Maya understood that Dr. Whitmore had weaponized the evaluation process against her. By documenting subjective concerns about her clinical reasoning, he had created a narrative that would follow her throughout medical school and beyond. Future poor performance could be attributed to the fundamental limitations he had identified, while future success could be dismissed as improvement under proper guidance. But Maya also understood something else. Dr. Whitmore had made a critical error. His evaluation was so inconsistent with her actual performance that it would eventually raise questions among other faculty members who observed her work. Academic medicine was a small community where reputations were built on consistent excellence, and Maya's performance in other courses would eventually contradict Dr. Whitmore's assessment. The third examination brought with it a new dimension of challenge. Dr. Whitmore announced that he would be implementing peer evaluation as part of the assessment process, requiring students to work in small groups and evaluate each other's contributions to collaborative problem-solving exercises. Maya immediately recognized the danger. Peer evaluation systems were vulnerable to social dynamics and unconscious bias, allowing personal relationships and group popularity to influence academic assessments. Students who had been uncomfortable with her success might see this as an opportunity to level the playing field through subjective evaluations rather than objective performance. The groups were assigned randomly, but Maya suspected that Dr. Whitmore had influenced the selection process when she found herself paired with James Harrison and 2 other students who had previously expressed resentment about her academic success. The group dynamic was tense from the beginning, with subtle comments and body language that made clear Maya's contributions would be scrutinized more critically than those of her teammates. The assignment required the group to analyze a complex medical case and develop a comprehensive treatment plan. Maya approached the task with her characteristic thoroughness, researching current literature and consulting multiple resources to ensure their recommendations were evidence-based and complete. But her teammates seemed more interested in social cohesion than academic excellence. They preferred quick consensus to rigorous analysis, choosing treatment options based on what seemed reasonable, rather than what research supported. When Maya suggested additional considerations or alternative approaches, she was accused of being difficult or overthinking the problem. James Harrison emerged as the informal group leader, using his social confidence to guide discussions and make final decisions about their recommendations. He had a talent for appearing collaborative while actually controlling the group process, dismissing ideas that challenged his preferences while making others feel included in decision-making. When Maya presented research findings that contradicted the group's initial conclusions, James smiled patronizingly and said, "Maya, we appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to focus on practical solutions rather than academic theory. Patients need doctors who can make decisions, not researchers who can quote studies." The comment stung because it echoed Dr. Whitmore's criticisms about over-reliance on academic frameworks. Maya found herself caught between compromising her standards to maintain group harmony or maintaining her principles at the cost of social acceptance. She chose to maintain her principles. When the group presented their case analysis to Dr. Whitmore, Maya had documented extensive research supporting alternative treatment approaches that her teammates had dismissed. She had identified potential complications they had overlooked and suggested monitoring protocols that would improve patient safety. But during the presentation, James Harrison positioned himself as the group's spokesman, taking credit for ideas Maya had contributed while subtly undermining her suggestions as overly complex or impractical. The other group members supported his narrative, either through active agreement or passive silence. Dr. Whitmore watched the presentation with apparent satisfaction, occasionally nodding approval at James's confident delivery, while frowning whenever Maya attempted to clarify or expand upon the group's recommendations. When Maya tried to present her additional research findings, Dr. Whitmore interrupted her. "Ms. Chen, medical practice requires teamwork and consensus building. Individual brilliance matters less than the ability to work collaboratively toward common goals." The message was clear. Maya's academic excellence was being reframed as a liability that interfered with team dynamics. Her thoroughness was characterized as obsessiveness, her high standards as inflexibility, and her evidence-based approach as academic arrogance. When the peer evaluations were submitted, Maya wasn't surprised to learn that her teammates had rated her contributions poorly. James Harrison's evaluation described her as difficult to work with and, quote, more interested in showing off her knowledge than contributing to team success. The other students largely echoed his assessment, creating a documentary record that supported Dr. Whitmore's narrative about her professional limitations. Maya realized that she was facing a coordinated campaign designed to undermine her academic success and professional reputation. Dr. Whitmore had created assessment structures that allowed bias to masquerade as objective evaluation, while students like James Harrison had found ways to benefit from undermining their most competent classmates. The fourth examination pushed the boundaries of fairness even further. Dr. Whitmore announced that students would be required to present complex cases to a panel of faculty members, with their presentations evaluated not just on medical accuracy, but on communication skills, professional presence, and clinical judgment. Maya understood that this format would allow even more subjective evaluation, giving Dr. Whitmore opportunities to influence other faculty members' assessments of her performance. But she also recognized that it would provide her with a broader audience for demonstrating her competence, potentially exposing Dr. Whitmore's bias to colleagues who might question his evaluations. She prepared for the presentation with exhaustive thoroughness, researching not just the medical aspects of her assigned case, but also communication strategies and presentation techniques. She practiced her delivery until every word was precise, every transition smooth, and every visual aid perfectly designed to support her arguments. The presentation day arrived with Maya feeling more nervous than she had for any previous examination. The faculty panel included Dr. Whitmore, along with 3 other professors from different departments, each bringing their own perspectives and potential biases to the evaluation process. Maya's assigned case involved a patient with complex autoimmune disease requiring coordination between multiple specialties. She had chosen this case specifically because it allowed her to demonstrate the integrative thinking and collaborative approach that Dr. Whitmore claimed she lacked. Her presentation was flawless. She outlined the patient's clinical history with precision, analyzed the diagnostic challenges with sophistication, and proposed treatment strategies that balanced efficacy with safety considerations. She addressed questions from the faculty panel with confidence and accuracy, demonstrating both broad knowledge and deep understanding. But as Maya presented, she could see Dr. Whitmore's expression growing increasingly dark. Her excellent performance was undermining his narrative about her limitations, potentially embarrassing him in front of his colleagues. She watched him take notes throughout her presentation, presumably documenting criticisms that would justify a poor evaluation despite her obvious competence. When Maya finished her presentation, the other faculty members responded with evident approval. Dr. Sarah Peterson from the Immunology Department complimented her analysis of the autoimmune mechanisms. Dr. Michael Torres from Internal Medicine praised her integration of multiple subspecialty perspectives. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Clinical Skills commended her clear communication and professional demeanor. But Dr. Whitmore's response was starkly different. He questioned her clinical reasoning, challenged her treatment recommendations, and suggested that her presentation demonstrated exactly the kind of academic overthinking that interfered with practical patient care. The contrast was so obvious that the other faculty members began exchanging glances. Dr. Peterson frowned when Dr. Whitmore dismissed Maya's immunological analysis as textbook thinking divorced from clinical reality. Dr. Torres looked uncomfortable when Dr. Whitmore characterized her treatment plan as overly complex and impractical for real-world settings. Maya realized that Dr. Whitmore's bias was becoming apparent to his colleagues. His criticism was so disproportionate to her performance that it raised questions about his objectivity and judgment. But she also understood that challenging a senior faculty member's assessment directly would be professionally dangerous, regardless of how unfair that assessment might be. When the evaluations were completed, Maya received mixed results that reflected the divided opinions of the faculty panel. The three guest evaluators gave her excellent marks across all categories, praising her knowledge, reasoning, and communication skills. Dr. Whitmore's evaluation was scathingly negative, describing her performance as, quote, technically adequate, but lacking the clinical intuition necessary for effective patient care. The average of these evaluations placed Maya in the middle of the class rankings, despite a presentation that clearly deserved top marks. More importantly, Dr. Whitmore's consistently negative evaluations were creating a pattern in her academic record that could affect her future opportunities in medicine. Maya left the presentation knowing that she had reached a critical juncture in her medical school experience. She had demonstrated excellent knowledge, analytical thinking, and professional skills, but Dr. Whitmore's campaign against her was intensifying, rather than diminishing. His criticism was becoming more obvious to other faculty members, but institutional loyalty and hierarchical respect made it unlikely that anyone would challenge his assessments directly. That evening, Maya sat in her apartment reviewing the semester's events. She had performed excellently on every objective measure of competence. But Dr. Whitmore's subjective evaluations were systematically undermining her academic standing. His bias was becoming apparent to observant colleagues, but the medical school's hierarchical structure protected him from direct challenge. Maya understood that she was fighting more than just one professor's prejudice. She was confronting a system that allowed subjective bias to masquerade as professional judgment, that protected established faculty members from accountability, and that placed the burden of proof on students who faced discrimination rather than on professors who practiced it. But Maya also understood something else. Truth had a way of emerging, even in environments designed to suppress it. Dr. Whitmore's increasingly obvious bias was creating cognitive dissonance among other faculty members who observed Maya's work. His evaluations were becoming so inconsistent with her actual performance that they would eventually invite scrutiny from higher levels of academic administration. The semester was nearing its end, but Maya's real test was just beginning. Dr. Whitmore had escalated his campaign against her to levels that were attracting attention from colleagues who might have remained neutral if his bias had been more subtle. Maya's excellent performance was forcing other faculty members to choose between supporting obvious competence or enabling clear discrimination. As Maya prepared for final examinations, she realized that her success or failure would have implications beyond her personal academic career. She was fighting for the principle that merit should matter more than bias, that excellence should be protected rather than punished, and that medical education should prepare the best possible physicians, regardless of their backgrounds or identities. The final examination of the semester would test more than Maya's knowledge of pathophysiology. It would test whether excellence could survive in an environment where authority was used to suppress rather than nurture talent, where bias masqueraded as professional judgment, and where institutional hierarchy protected discrimination from accountability. Maya opened her textbooks and began to study, preparing not just for an examination, but for a battle that would determine whether she would be allowed to continue pursuing her dream of becoming a physician. Dr. Whitmore had made clear that he considered her presence in medical school a mistake that needed to be corrected. Maya was determined to prove that the only mistake was his failure to recognize excellence when he encountered it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the difference between authority and competence, between institutional power and professional merit. Maya Chen had been told she didn't belong in medical school, but she was preparing to demonstrate that belonging wasn't determined by the prejudices of those in power. It was earned through dedication, competence, and the courage to persist in the face of injustice. The final examination arrived like a storm that had been building all semester. Dr. Whitmore announced that it would be comprehensive, covering not just recent material, but integrating concepts from throughout the course. More ominously, he revealed that the examination would account for 50% of the final grade, giving him enormous power to determine each student's academic fate. Maya had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reviewing not just the assigned material, but exploring connections between different pathophysiological processes and their clinical implications. She understood that this examination represented more than an academic assessment. It was Dr. Whitmore's final opportunity to prove that his negative evaluations of her performance had been justified. The examination was scheduled for 3 hours, but Dr. Whitmore had prepared enough questions to challenge students for twice that long. As Maya read through the test, she realized that many questions went far beyond the course curriculum, requiring knowledge that students could only have acquired through extensive independent research. But Maya had done that research. Her months of intensive preparation had taken her deep into primary literature, clinical case studies, and advanced texts that most of her classmates had never encountered. Questions that might have stumped other students felt familiar because she had explored these topics during her systematic review of pathophysiological mechanisms. She worked through the examination methodically, taking time to think through each question carefully before committing to her answers. Around her, she could hear other students struggling with the difficulty and scope of the material. Several students finished early, apparently giving up on questions they couldn't answer. Others worked frantically until the final minute, trying to complete sections they hadn't had time to study adequately. Maya used every minute of the allotted time, reviewing her answers and ensuring that her explanations were complete and accurate. She had learned from her previous encounters with Dr. Whitmore that partial answers or incomplete reasoning would be interpreted as evidence of inadequate understanding, regardless of whether other students received credit for similar responses. When she finally submitted her examination, Maya felt confident about her performance, but uncertain about the evaluation she would receive. Dr. Whitmore had demonstrated repeatedly that his assessment of her work reflected his preconceptions rather than her actual competence. Even excellent performance might not protect her from his determination to prove that she didn't belong in medical school. The results were delayed for 2 weeks, an unusually long time for examination grading. When Dr. Whitmore finally posted the grades, Maya was shocked by what she found. Her score was 96%, the highest grade in the class by a significant margin. The second highest score was 87%, achieved by James Harrison despite his obvious struggles with the material's complexity. Maya stared at the grade posting, reading her student identification number multiple times to ensure she wasn't mistaken. After months of receiving evaluations that undermined her competence despite excellent performance, Dr. Whitmore had finally given her the grade that her knowledge deserved. But Maya's initial satisfaction was quickly replaced by wariness. Dr. Whitmore wasn't the kind of person who admitted mistakes gracefully, and her exceptional performance on his final examination would make his previous negative evaluations appear even more obviously biased. She suspected that this high grade came with strings attached, representing strategic calculation rather than genuine recognition of her competence. Her suspicions were confirmed when Dr. Whitmore requested a private meeting to discuss her academic progress. Maya entered his office with cautious optimism, hoping that her examination performance had finally convinced him to reassess his prejudiced assumptions about her capabilities. Dr. Whitmore's demeanor was different during this meeting, less openly hostile, but somehow more dangerous. He congratulated Maya on her examination performance, but immediately qualified his praise with concerns about her overall development as a medical student. "Miss Chen, your factual knowledge is clearly exceptional," he began, his tone suggesting that exceptional knowledge was somehow problematic. "However, I remain concerned about your ability to translate that knowledge into effective clinical practice. Medical school teaches more than facts. It develops professional judgment, interpersonal skills, and the kind of practical wisdom that distinguishes good doctors from mere academic performers." Maya listened carefully, recognizing that Dr. Whitmore was constructing a new narrative to explain away her success. If she couldn't be dismissed as incompetent, she would be characterized as overly academic, technically proficient, but lacking the human qualities necessary for effective patient care. "I've been reviewing your peer evaluations and clinical presentations," Dr. Whitmore continued. "While your knowledge is impressive, multiple assessments suggest difficulties with teamwork, communication, and professional relationships. These are areas where improvement will be essential for your continued success in medical school." The message was clear: drive. Whitmore was shifting his attack from her intellectual capabilities to her professional character. Maya's academic excellence could no longer be questioned, so he would focus on subjective assessments of her interpersonal skills and professional behavior, areas where bias could operate more freely without obvious contradiction by objective evidence. Maya understood that this new strategy was potentially more dangerous than Dr. Whitmore's previous approach. Questions about her knowledge could be answered through examinations and presentations, but concerns about her character and interpersonal skills were much harder to refute. They relied on subjective impressions and social dynamics that were inherently vulnerable to prejudice and manipulation. Dr. Whitmore concluded the meeting by recommending that Maya seek additional support for developing her professional skills. He suggested counseling services, communication workshops, and leadership training programs, interventions typically recommended for struggling students rather than those achieving academic excellence. Maya left the meeting understanding that her battle with Dr. Whitmore had entered a new phase. Having failed to prove her intellectually inadequate, he was now attempting to characterize her as professionally unsuitable for medical practice. The focus had shifted from her knowledge to her character, from objective measures of competence to subjective assessments of personality and behavior. But Maya also realized that Dr. Whitmore had made another critical error. His sudden shift from criticizing her knowledge to praising it while questioning her character created logical inconsistencies that careful observers would notice. Faculty members who had witnessed her excellent presentations would find it difficult to reconcile Dr. Whitmore's concerns about her communication skills with the professional competence they had observed directly. As the semester concluded, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her from that first humiliating encounter in Dr. Whitmore's lecture hall to her current position as the top performer in his class. She had proven her intellectual capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt, but she understood that her challenges were far from over. Dr. Whitmore had invested too much credibility in his assessment of her inadequacy to abandon his campaign easily. If direct academic measures couldn't support his conclusions, he would rely on subjective evaluations and character assassinations that were harder to challenge through objective evidence. Maya also understood that her exceptional performance was attracting attention from other faculty members who were beginning to question Dr. Whitmore's consistently negative evaluations of obviously competent work. The cognitive dissonance between her achievements and his assessments was becoming too obvious to ignore, creating potential allies among professors who valued merit over bias. But perhaps most importantly, Maya realized that her fight had transcended personal vindication. She was battling for principles that affected every student who faced discrimination in academic settings, demonstrating that excellence could survive, even when authority figures attempted to suppress it through bias and manipulation. The war was far from over, but Maya had won significant battles. She had proven her intellectual competence, exposed the illogical nature of her critics' arguments, and begun to attract support from colleagues who recognized obvious talent despite institutional pressure to ignore it. As she prepared for the next semester, Maya knew that Dr. Whitmore would continue his campaign against her, probably with even greater subtlety and sophistication. But she also knew that truth had momentum, that excellent performance would eventually overcome prejudiced evaluation, and that her persistence in the face of injustice was inspiring other students who faced similar challenges. Maya Chen had been told she didn't belong in medical school, but she had responded by demonstrating excellence so undeniable that even her harshest critic had been forced to acknowledge it academically. The battle for her professional character was just beginning, but Maya approached it with the same determination and integrity that had carried her through every previous challenge. She belonged in medical school not because someone in authority decided she did, but because she had the knowledge, skills, and character necessary to become an exceptional physician. Dr. Whitmore's campaign against her had only strengthened her resolve and clarified her purpose: to prove that merit matters more than bias, that excellence deserves protection rather than persecution, and that belonging is earned through competence rather than granted through privilege. The second semester began with subtle changes that Maya noticed immediately. Dr. Whitmore's advanced clinical pathology course had been restructured to emphasize what he called holistic medical education, incorporating assessments of professional behavior, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal effectiveness alongside traditional academic measures. Maya understood that these changes were designed specifically to create new avenues for undermining her success through subjective evaluations that would be difficult to challenge. But Maya also noticed something else. The composition of her class had changed. 3 students had transferred out of the program during the winter break, unable to handle the academic rigor and psychological pressure of Dr. Whitmore's teaching methods. Their departure had created opportunities for new students to join the class, and among these newcomers was someone who would change everything. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived as a visiting professor from Johns Hopkins, invited to collaborate on a research project with the pathology department. She was brilliant, accomplished, and possessed the kind of academic credibility that made her opinion matter to other faculty members. More importantly, she had a reputation for fairness and integrity that transcended institutional politics. Maya first encountered Dr. Rodriguez during a clinical correlations seminar, where students were required to present complex cases to a mixed audience of faculty and residents. Maya had been assigned a challenging case involving a patient with multiple autoimmune disorders, exactly the kind of complex scenario that Dr. Whitmore used to expose what he claimed were her limitations in clinical reasoning. As Maya presented her case analysis, she could feel Dr. Whitmore's disapproving gaze boring into her. Every pause in her delivery was noted, every clarification interpreted as uncertainty, every detailed explanation characterized as overthinking. But Dr. Rodriguez watched with different eyes, asking insightful questions that demonstrated genuine interest in Maya's reasoning process rather than attempts to trip her up. When Maya concluded her presentation, the responses from the faculty panel revealed the growing divide in opinions about her competence. Dr. Whitmore offered his usual criticisms about academic theorizing divorced from clinical reality, but Dr. Rodriguez's response was strikingly different. Ms. Chen, your analysis demonstrates exactly the kind of systematic thinking that distinguishes excellent clinicians from merely adequate ones, Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying authority that commanded attention. Your integration of basic science principles with clinical observations is sophisticated and thorough. This is precisely how I would want a physician to approach complex patients. The contrast with Dr. Whitmore's assessment was so stark that other faculty members began paying closer attention. Dr. Rodriguez wasn't just offering polite encouragement. She was providing professional evaluation that directly contradicted months of negative assessments from Dr. Whitmore. After the seminar, Dr. Rodriguez approached Maya privately. I've been reviewing student records as part of my research collaboration, she said quietly. Your academic performance is exceptional, but I noticed some concerning inconsistencies in faculty evaluations. Would you be willing to discuss your experience in this program? Maya felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. Dr. Rodriguez represented the first faculty member who had explicitly questioned the narrative that Dr. Whitmore had constructed about her capabilities. But Maya also understood the risks of appearing to complain about professors or blame others for academic challenges. She chose her words carefully. I found some aspects of the program more challenging than others, Maya said diplomatically. I'm always looking for ways to improve my performance and better meet faculty expectations. Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. Excellence should be recognized and nurtured, not criticized and constrained. I've seen your work, and I've seen similar talent throughout my career. What you're demonstrating is exactly what medical education should produce. The conversation was brief, but it planted seeds that would grow throughout the semester. Dr. Rodriguez began attending more of Dr. Whitmore's classes, ostensibly to observe teaching methods, but actually to witness the dynamics that had created such inconsistent evaluations of obviously talented students. What she observed alarmed her. Dr. Whitmore's treatment of Maya was so obviously biased that it raised questions about his professional judgment and ethical standards. He interrupted Maya's answers more frequently than those of other students, demanded higher levels of justification for her reasoning, and interpreted her thoroughness as a character flaw rather than a professional strength. But Dr. Rodriguez also observed something else. Maya's responses to this treatment revealed exactly the kind of grace under pressure that characterized exceptional physicians. Rather than becoming defensive or combative, Maya maintained her professionalism while continuing to demonstrate superior knowledge and analytical thinking. The turning point came during a particularly egregious display of bias in mid-February. Dr. Whitmore had assigned students to work in pairs on complex diagnostic challenges, with each team required to present their findings to the entire class. Maya had been paired with Jessica Wong, a capable student who appreciated Maya's thorough approach to clinical reasoning. Their assigned case involved a patient with neurological symptoms that could indicate several different conditions, requiring careful analysis of clinical findings and diagnostic test results. Maya and Jessica worked together effectively, combining their knowledge and perspectives to develop a comprehensive differential diagnosis and evidence-based treatment plan. When they presented their analysis, it was clear to everyone in the room that their work was superior to that of other teams. They had identified diagnostic possibilities that others had missed, proposed additional testing that would clarify ambiguous findings, and developed treatment strategies that balanced efficacy with safety considerations. But Dr. Whitmore's response focused entirely on criticizing Maya's contributions while praising Jessica's insights. He characterized Maya's systematic approach as unnecessarily complex, while describing Jessica's more intuitive reasoning as clinically sophisticated. The bias was so obvious that students began exchanging uncomfortable glances. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been observing from the back of the classroom, decided that she had seen enough. During the break that followed the presentations, she requested a private word with Dr. Whitmore. Their conversation was brief but intense, conducted in hushed tones that nonetheless conveyed serious professional disagreement. Maya didn't learn the details of that conversation until weeks later, but its effects were immediately apparent. Dr. Whitmore's behavior toward her became more carefully controlled, as if he understood that his actions were being scrutinized by someone whose opinion mattered to senior administration. But Dr. Whitmore's campaign against Maya didn't end. It simply became more subtle and sophisticated. Instead of obvious classroom bias, he began documenting concerns about Maya's professional development and interpersonal skills in formal evaluation reports. He scheduled mandatory meetings to discuss her progress and recommended additional training programs designed to address supposed deficiencies in communication and teamwork. Maya understood that Dr. Whitmore was creating a paper trail that would support his narrative about her professional limitations. Unlike academic performance, which could be measured objectively, professional behavior was inherently subjective and therefore more vulnerable to biased interpretation. But Maya also understood that Dr. Rodriguez was building her own documentation. As a visiting professor conducting research on medical education, Dr. Rodriguez had legitimate reasons to observe classes, review student records, and interview faculty members about their teaching methods and assessment practices. What Dr. Rodriguez discovered was a pattern of discrimination that extended beyond Maya's individual case. Dr. Whitmore's treatment of students reflected unconscious biases that systematically disadvantaged women, minorities, and first-generation college students. His evaluations consistently rated these students more harshly than their male, white, or privileged classmates, even when objective measures of performance suggested equal or superior competence. Dr. Rodriguez began documenting these patterns systematically, comparing Dr. Whitmore's evaluations with those of other faculty members, and identifying discrepancies that suggested bias rather than legitimate assessment differences. Her research revealed that students from underrepresented backgrounds were significantly more likely to receive negative evaluations from Dr. Whitmore, regardless of their actual academic performance. Meanwhile, Maya continued to excel in her other courses, earning recognition from professors who evaluated her work without the prejudices that colored Dr. Whitmore's assessments. Dr. Sarah Chen in immunology praised Maya's research on autoimmune mechanisms. Dr. Michael Torres in internal medicine commended her clinical reasoning during patient presentations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh in medical ethics highlighted Maya's thoughtful analysis of complex bioethical dilemmas. The contrast between these positive evaluations and Dr. Whitmore's negative assessments was becoming too obvious for other faculty members to ignore. During department meetings, questions began to arise about the consistency of student evaluations and the criteria being used to assess professional competence. Dr. Rodriguez used these discussions to raise broader questions about fairness and bias in medical education. She presented research on unconscious bias in academic settings, discussed best practices for objective evaluation, and shared data about the importance of diverse perspectives in medical practice. Her presentations were diplomatically worded but clearly targeted, addressing issues that everyone in the room recognized as relevant to current departmental dynamics. Faculty members who had remained neutral in the conflict between Maya and Dr. Whitmore began to understand that larger principles were at stake. The breakthrough came in March, when Maya was assigned to work with Dr. Rodriguez on a research project examining genetic factors in autoimmune disease. The collaboration gave Dr. Rodriguez an opportunity to observe Maya's intellectual capabilities directly, free from the hostile environment of Dr. Whitmore's classroom. What Dr. Rodriguez discovered exceeded even her high expectations. Maya's understanding of molecular mechanisms was sophisticated and nuanced. Her ability to analyze complex data was exceptional. Her written communication was clear and precise. Most importantly, her approach to research demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic thinking and intellectual honesty that characterized the best scientists and clinicians. Dr. Rodriguez realized that she wasn't just observing a talented student who had been unfairly treated. She was witnessing the persecution of someone with the potential to make significant contributions to medical science and patient care. Maya possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance, methodical discipline, and personal integrity that defined truly exceptional physicians. The research collaboration also revealed something else. Maya's supposed deficiencies in interpersonal skills were entirely fabricated. She worked effectively with research assistants, communicated clearly with laboratory personnel, and demonstrated the kind of collaborative spirit that made complex projects successful. The problems with teamwork and communication that Dr. Whitmore had documented existed only in environments where she faced hostility and bias. Armed with this evidence, Dr. Rodriguez decided to take direct action. She requested a meeting with Dr. Patricia Huang, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, to discuss concerns about student evaluation practices in the pathology department. The meeting was scheduled for late March, just as Maya was preparing for the semester's most important assessment, a comprehensive examination that would determine her standing in the medical school's competitive academic hierarchy. Dr. Whitmore had announced that this examination would be particularly challenging, requiring students to demonstrate not just knowledge but the kind of clinical judgment and professional reasoning that distinguished future physicians from mere academic performers. Maya approached this examination with the same methodical preparation that had characterized her approach to every previous challenge. She reviewed not just the assigned material, but explored connections between different disease processes, clinical presentations, and treatment modalities. She practiced articulating complex ideas clearly and concisely, knowing that Dr. Whitmore would scrutinize her communication style as closely as her medical knowledge. But Maya also prepared for something else. The possibility that this examination might be her last opportunity to demonstrate her competence before Dr. Whitmore's campaign against her achieved its ultimate goal of forcing her out of medical school. She understood that excellent performance might not be enough to overcome months of negative evaluations and documented concerns about her professional suitability. The examination was administered over 2 days, combining written assessments with oral presentations and practical demonstrations of clinical skills. Maya performed exceptionally well on every component, drawing upon the comprehensive knowledge and analytical abilities that had carried her through every previous challenge. But as she completed the final section of the examination, Maya felt a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. She knew that her performance had been excellent, but she also knew that Dr. Whitmore's evaluation would reflect his predetermined conclusions rather than her actual competence. The results were posted 1 week later, and Maya was shocked by what she found. Not only had she achieved the highest score in the class, but her performance had been so exceptional that it established a new record for the examination. Her scores were significantly higher than those achieved by students in previous years, demonstrating mastery that exceeded even Dr. Whitmore's rigorous standards. But Maya's initial elation was quickly tempered by wariness. She had learned not to trust Dr. Whitmore's apparent recognition of her competence, understanding that his strategies for undermining her success had become increasingly sophisticated and subtle. Her suspicions were confirmed when Dr. Whitmore requested another private meeting to discuss her academic progress. Maya entered his office prepared for whatever new form of attack he had devised, but what she encountered was something entirely different. Dr. Whitmore's demeanor was subdued, almost defeated. He congratulated Maya on her examination performance, but seemed reluctant to engage in his usual criticisms of her approach or character. Instead, he spoke vaguely about the challenges of medical education and the difficulty of predicting which students would ultimately succeed in clinical practice. Maya sensed that something fundamental had changed, but she couldn't identify the source of Dr. Whitmore's altered behavior. She maintained her professional composure while listening to his rambling comments about medical education and student assessment, waiting for the real purpose of the meeting to emerge. It never did. After 20 minutes of awkward conversation, Dr. Whitmore dismissed Maya without the usual recommendations for improvement or warnings about professional development. She left his office more confused than relieved, uncertain about what had caused such a dramatic change in his approach. The explanation came 2 days later, when Maya received a message requesting her presence at a meeting with Dr. Huang, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Maya's initial anxiety about the meeting's purpose gave way to curiosity when she arrived to find Dr. Rodriguez already present, along with Dr. Whitmore and 2 other senior faculty members she didn't recognize. Dr. Huang began the meeting with an announcement that changed everything Maya thought she understood about her situation. Ms. Chen, we've asked you here to discuss some irregularities that have come to light regarding student evaluation practices in the pathology department. Dr. Rodriguez has brought to our attention some concerns about the consistency and fairness of assessments, particularly as they relate to your academic experience. Maya felt her heart rate quicken as she realized that her months of persecution were finally being subjected to official scrutiny. Dr. Rodriguez had not just observed Dr. Whitmore's bias, she had documented it systematically and presented evidence to senior administration. Dr. Rodriguez spoke next, her voice calm but authoritative. Ms. Chen, I've been conducting research on evaluation practices in medical education, and your case has raised significant concerns about unconscious bias and inconsistent assessment standards. Would you be comfortable discussing your experience in Dr. Whitmore's courses? Maya looked around the room, noting the serious expressions of the senior faculty members and Dr. Whitmore's obvious discomfort. For the first time since entering medical school, she felt that someone in authority was genuinely interested in hearing her perspective rather than dismissing her concerns. She chose her words carefully, describing her experience factually without appearing to attack Dr. Whitmore personally. She outlined the pattern of negative evaluations that contradicted her objective academic performance, the subjective assessments that seemed inconsistent with evaluations from other faculty members, and the hostile classroom environment that had made learning more difficult than necessary. As Maya spoke, she could see Dr. Whitmore's face growing increasingly pale. The evidence Dr. Rodriguez had compiled, combined with Maya's first-hand account, painted a picture of systematic bias that was impossible to dismiss or explain away. Dr. Wang asked pointed questions about specific incidents, referring to documentation that Dr. Rodriguez had apparently provided. Maya realized that every biased evaluation, every unfair assessment, every hostile interaction had been carefully recorded and analyzed by someone with the expertise and credibility to recognize discrimination when she encountered it. The meeting concluded with Dr. Huang announcing that the medical school would be conducting a comprehensive review of student evaluation practices, with particular attention to ensuring fairness and consistency across all departments. Dr. Whitmore was informed that his assessments of Maya's performance would be reviewed by an independent committee and that future evaluations would be subject to additional oversight. But the most significant announcement came last. Dr. Huang informed Maya that her academic record would be formally corrected to reflect her actual performance rather than the biased evaluations she had received. Her class ranking would be adjusted upward, and the negative comments about her professional development would be removed from her permanent file. Maya left the meeting feeling stunned by the magnitude of what had just occurred. After months of fighting alone against institutional bias, she had finally found allies with the power and credibility to demand justice. Her academic record would be restored, her reputation rehabilitated, and her future opportunities protected from the damage Dr. Whitmore had attempted to inflict. But perhaps more importantly, Maya realized that her struggle had created changes that would benefit other students who faced similar challenges. The evaluation review process that Dr. Huang had announced would establish new safeguards against bias, ensuring that future students would be protected from the kind of discrimination Maya had endured. Word of the investigation spread quickly through the medical school, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond Maya's individual case. Students who had witnessed Dr. Whitmore's biased treatment of Maya began to understand that such behavior was not acceptable, that excellence deserved protection rather than persecution, and that institutional authority could be held accountable when it was abused. Dr. Whitmore's reputation within the medical school suffered irreparable damage. Colleagues who had previously respected his expertise began to question his judgment and integrity. Students who had once feared his criticism started to see his harsh evaluations as reflections of his own limitations rather than accurate assessments of their capabilities. Maya's vindication was complete, but she approached her success with characteristic humility and grace. When classmates congratulated her on overcoming Dr. Whitmore's bias, she emphasized the importance of institutional changes rather than personal victory. When faculty members praised her persistence in the face of discrimination, she focused on the need to protect future students from similar treatment. The third semester began with Maya's restoration to her rightful place at the top of her class. Her corrected academic record reflected her true performance, establishing her as one of the most promising students in her cohort. More importantly, the evaluation reforms that Dr. Rodriguez had championed created a more fair and supportive learning environment for all students. Dr. Whitmore remained on the faculty, but his role was significantly diminished. He was no longer permitted to evaluate students without oversight, his teaching methods were subject to regular review, and his future at the institution was clearly precarious. Maya occasionally encountered him in hallways or faculty meetings, but their interactions were limited to polite professional greetings that acknowledged their shared presence without revisiting past conflicts. Maya's research collaboration with Dr. Rodriguez flourished, producing publications that established her reputation as a promising young scientist. Her clinical rotations earned praise from supervising physicians who recognized her exceptional analytical abilities and compassionate patient care. Most importantly, she began to identify her future specialty interests, drawn to fields where her systematic thinking and thorough approach would be valued rather than criticized. As Maya progressed through medical school, she became a mentor to younger students who faced their own challenges with bias and discrimination. Her story became part of the institutional memory, a reminder that excellence could survive even determined efforts to suppress it, and that persistence in the face of injustice could create lasting change. Dr. Rodriguez's research on evaluation bias in medical education gained national attention, leading to reforms at medical schools throughout the country. Maya's case became a catalyst for broader discussions about diversity, inclusion, and fairness in medical training, demonstrating that individual acts of discrimination had implications that extended far beyond their immediate victims. Maya's graduation day arrived with ceremonies that celebrated not just her academic achievements but the principle she had fought to defend: that medical education should nurture excellence regardless of its source, that competence should be recognized and rewarded, and that bias had no place in the training of future physicians. As she walked across the stage to receive her medical degree, Maya thought about the journey that had brought her from that first humiliating encounter in Dr. Whitmore's lecture hall to this moment of triumph. She had been told she didn't belong in medical school, but she had proven that belonging was earned through competence, dedication, and integrity rather than granted through privilege or protected through bias. Her parents sat in the audience, their faces beaming with pride that transcended their daughter's individual success. They understood that Maya's achievement represented vindication of their decision to sacrifice everything for their children's education, proof that merit could overcome prejudice when supported by persistence and principle. Maya's story continued beyond graduation as she entered residency training at one of the country's most prestigious hospitals. Her reputation for excellence had preceded her, but more importantly, Her experience with discrimination had taught her to recognize and address bias whenever she encountered it. She became an advocate for fair evaluation practices, a mentor to students from underrepresented backgrounds, and a leader in efforts to create more inclusive medical training environments. Dr. Whitmore's career never recovered from the revelation of his biased evaluation practices. He was eventually forced to take early retirement, his legacy tainted by the recognition that his authority had been used to suppress rather than nurture talent. His departure was celebrated quietly by students and faculty who had witnessed his unfair treatment of Maya and other underrepresented students. The evaluation reforms that Dr. Rodriguez had championed became a model for medical schools nationwide, creating systematic protections against bias and ensuring that student assessment reflected actual competence rather than subjective prejudices. Maya's case had catalyzed changes that would protect thousands of future medical students from the kind of discrimination she had endured. Years later, as Dr. Maya Chen established herself as a leading physician and researcher, she reflected on the lessons learned during her medical school years. She had discovered that excellence was not always welcomed, that competence could be perceived as threatening by insecure authority figures, and that institutional systems sometimes protected bias rather than merit. But she had also learned that truth had power, that persistence could overcome prejudice, and that individual acts of courage could create lasting change. Her refusal to accept Dr. Whitmore's assessment of her capabilities had not just vindicated her own competence, it had created a more fair and just system for evaluating all students. Maya's story became part of the medical school's official history, cited in diversity training programs and institutional reform efforts. Her experience demonstrated that discrimination could be overcome through excellence, that bias could be exposed through documentation, and that justice could be achieved when people of integrity were willing to take risks to defend what was right. But perhaps the most important lesson of Maya's story was simpler and more fundamental. That belonging in medical school, like belonging in medicine itself, was not determined by the prejudices of those in power, but by the knowledge, skills, and character necessary to heal others. Maya Chen had been told she didn't belong, but she had proven that belonging was earned through competence and confirmed through courage. Her legacy would inspire future generations of medical students who faced their own challenges with bias and discrimination, proving that excellence could survive even determined efforts to suppress it, and that the pursuit of justice was not just a personal endeavor, but a professional obligation that defined the very best of medical practice. The white coat Maya wore as she began her medical career carried with it the weight of her struggle and the significance of her victory. She had not just earned her place in medicine, she had helped to ensure that future students would find doors open rather than closed, opportunity rather than obstruction, and recognition rather than persecution when they demonstrated the excellence that medicine demanded and deserved. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.